Claude Code agents released recently, and they are mind-blowingly great. But sadly, a lot of the examples of these things that I've seen out there are 2 thumbs down. I'm talking about basic little prompts like, you're a senior backend engineer, so build me a backend, I guess? Well, today we will end that together, like a fellowship, because we're gonna go through 8 custom Claude Code agents that I built for you that can replace an entire end-to-end SaaS creation workflow. The goal of this, to replace an entire technical team. So we're gonna go through everything from product manager to DevOps engineer to security analyst and everything in between. These agents basically take my old vibe coding framework and turn it into a reasoning machine. So stick around because I'm gonna show you in this video how to replicate an entire end-to-end AI development team that will work for you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It doesn't ask for time off and it does not complain, usually. This might just be the most unfair advantage that a solo founder could ever have. So with all that out of the way, let's get into it. So first, a quick recap. What actually are Claude Code agents? They're basically specialized sub-agents that run inside of Claude Code and have access to their own custom system prompts, context windows, and specific tools that they can use. Now, the impact of these things is that you can code very technical things without having to be a technical genius. Now, if you've seen my old prompting system, you know it had these very long system of prompts that we would chain together, taking the output of each and pumping it into the next. Discovering these agents has been such a game changer because now I can provide those system prompts of how I want it to reason, and it can handle all of the details, knowing what it needs and what it doesn't need by itself. Now, these agents should be executed in a specific order, which we can get to later on in the video. But either way, these are a serious unfair advantage that if you use them, you will have over other people that do not use them, plain and simple. So we're gonna start with the basics and show you how to set up your first one and configure it, and then we will get into all 8 of them and how they work with specific examples. So the first thing that you wanna do is obviously open up Claude Code in your terminal. Now, there are 2 ways that you can do this. The first is that we can actually use a kind of guided onboarding process. So if you type in /agents and hit enter, you will have the option to create a new agent with their CLI. And so if we were to click, for example, create new agent, we can pick if we want this to live on our computer overall or if it's project specific. So for this example, we'll do project specific. And then we can either manually configure it or we can use the Claude Code helper. So in this example, I will use the Claude Code helper to show you how it works. So we hit enter. The first thing you need to do is describe when to use this agent. Now, I'm going to give a basic example here, but you do want to be comprehensive with your description. So let's say we want an agent that we use anytime we're debugging a problem. We can hit enter, and then this will actually create the agent for us and ask us which tools we want it to use. Now I'm going to show you a manual implementation. Now, after this process runs through, you're going to notice a directory got created called .claude/agents. Now, inside of this directory are going to be all of the agents that you have access to in this project. So this is an example of what this debugger agent might actually look like. So at the top, we have a name for it. We have a description of when the system should know to use it, right? Anytime it's analyzing and fixing bugs in code. And then we're going to give it a color that it can use, and we're going to specify the model that it should use. In this case, we're going to use Sonnet. Now, as we go and look through this file, we can see the instructions, right? The system prompt that we are giving to Claude Code anytime it executes this agent. And we can see what this looks like, right? What's the core philosophy of the agent? Which approach does it take? What are the input expectations it should expect? What types of things should it be debugging? How should it consider debugging them? What's the overall process? And so on. You can even specify specific tools that you want this agent to have access to. For example, maybe you have a specific MCP server that you use when you're debugging. You can use that here. So now before we get into the really cool stuff, let's just look at a very basic example of this. So let's say that we have this Python file that is just meant to calculate an average. And we're going to intentionally give it a bug just to show how this works. So if we were to go in here and actually run this script, we can see that it's supposed to have an average of 20, but it actually has an average of 30. So what we would do in this case is go into Claude, and I could say something like use our debugging agent to debug the Python file. Very basic example. But now what we can see is it actually instantiated that specific agent that we had created earlier, this debugger. And so it's going to go through and it's going to follow this entire process that we have in order to fix this very basic bug. So let's look at what this output looks like. And so now after this thing has run, we can see that it is implementing a fix in our file. And if we run the script, we can see that it's now fixed. Average is 30, average should be 30. Now, obviously that was a very basic example, so let's get into some more detailed examples. So we're gonna go through all 8 of these agents that I have for you, and yes, they will be made available in the description below the video. The one caveat that I will say is these are not necessarily the order that I would use them in. That video where we build a full end-to-end SaaS application that is ready for production is going to be coming later in the week. We're gonna be putting these all into a 6 to 7 phase system. So the first agent that we're going to look at is our product manager. And the reason we're doing that is if we're starting a project from scratch, we need to translate our abstract idea about this app into very concrete particulars of what needs to be inside the MVP. And in a SaaS company, this is what a product manager would do. They're almost like mini product CEOs where they need to take an idea and a problem and the resourcing that they have within their team, and they need to solve that problem and deliver the product. So this agent is kind of like a defense mechanism in some ways. It's going to allow you to overcome your own biases about what you think should be in that MVP, and instead it's going to look at the actual problems that the app is attempting to solve and how the specific features are going to solve those problems. So we're going to put in our general idea for the app, and we're going to get a lot of details out the other side. Let's go look at it. So the first thing, we have our configuration of the agent. So we're telling it what it is, what its persona is, and how it approaches solving problems. We're talking about the executive summary that we want it to create. For each feature that we're going to be building for this MVP, what is the exact formatting that we want for this? So the feature, the user story, the acceptance criteria, meaning what needs to be true so that we consider this thing done, and a bunch of other functional and non-functional requirements. So for this example, we are going to be building a project that was a request of me. So in this case, we're going to specifically tell it to use this agent, which it can intelligently pick agents, but for this case, we're going to tell it which agent to use. So we're going to say use the product manager agent based on the following app idea. The app is a Chrome extension that helps users shop for products that match their season color type. For context, seasonal color analysis is a sub-niche within fashion that specifies certain colors of clothing actually look mathematically better on people based on things like their skin tone, their hair color, their eye color, etc. Then I give 2 resources that break down the math of that specific thing. And now we can see this product manager agent that we created is going, and it's starting to use specific tools that we have access to. We will come back in a second once it is done and look at the output. All right, so that just ran. It ran for about 2 minutes actually, which was a little bit long, but let's see what we got out of it. So like we asked it to, we first got out our elevator pitch of what this app is. We get out our problem statement. Now, you would want to go through this output and make sure it's dialed in for what your app is actually supposed to be, because every other stage will build on this. So what is the actual problem statement? Most people struggle to identify this because they don't even know about it, which leads to poor purchasing decisions. You waste money on clothes that don't actually look good on you, and you just generally maybe don't even feel good about putting on clothes, like putting on nice things. So then we get into what are some of the primary personas of this target audience? What are the demographic breakdowns? What is the unique selling point of this thing? For this specifically, there is nothing like this actually out there. There are a lot of people that do the analysis, but not any that enable shopping through that specifically. So like we asked the system to do, we start going through user personas and pain points, and then we get down to the actual core user flow. So this is critical because this is what we're then gonna actually start building from. And so we break down, for example, the first flow. What does it look like to actually download and install this extension and go through the first onboarding phase? What does it then look like when you're actually actively shopping with it? Like, what is that interaction going to look like in the browser? And then we even have some secondary or even tertiary user flows, like creating wish lists, coordinating different colors. We get into feature stories, the acceptance criteria of those things, important considerations that we might want to have, like progress indicators. and a bunch of other really great stuff that I'm not going to go into because we'll go into this in that video next Thursday. So now the next agent we're going to look at is our UX UI designer, which is actually one of my most favored agents of the ones that I have built. Now, why do I say that? There's a reason that great apps feel great. And it's because someone very talented spent a lot of time thinking about how a user should actually engage with this thing in order to solve their problems. And so this agent helps us make sure of two things. Number one, that the app looks great, but number two, that it actually accomplishes what it's setting out to accomplish by the way it is designed and how the user will interact with it. Because let's face it, the best way to lose confidence of an end user is to have a crappy, janky experience that doesn't make them feel very good. So let's not do that. So again, this agent allows us to infuse the experience and expertise of a senior product designer and create that final polish for our app. So what happens with this agent is that it takes that output, it takes this product manager output that we just looked at, and it processes it. And so what it's doing is it's thinking through who we're selling to and what this app is meant to accomplish, and then it builds that into a cohesive design philosophy. And so it starts with these overarching principles like the design philosophy for the UI, core UX principles that like every feature needs to conform to. But then we get in and it actually builds us out a comprehensive design system. And so these are going to be things like color theory, our typography setup, how the spacing and the layout of the system is going to be, specific components and the visual specification of those components, how they interact with those components, how these components should be used in production. Because again, in a more established SaaS company, you're going to have a product designer or UX expert that builds the system that a front-end engineer then goes and implements. And so this is what we are trying to mimic at this stage. And so this last piece of this prompt is that we say you need to go feature by feature through this product manager output that I'm about to give you and build out the entire system of how this needs to look and how it needs to work. And there's a lot of really awesome stuff inside of this. And so this one's going to be simple. Execute the UX design agent based on the output found in our project documentation directory. Now, guys, one of the things that's really awesome about how this is an agent-based system is that it will go through, and as it creates things, if it realizes that it now needs to go back and update its to-do list, it's going to do that, which is a huge improvement over like a more static prompt-based system. All right, guys, so now once this is done, we have a comprehensive UI UX design system, and we can look at what this kind of looks like. So we have our overall design philosophy, our entire color system, spacing and layout, right? Everything we were talking about earlier. And then as we start to get further and further down, we start to see actual user journey mapping. And then we get screen by screen specification. So for example, in the onboarding screen, what is the visual layout? What is the actual hierarchy of content that a user is going to see? What type of animations, if any, are going to be in place? Same thing for the color season assessment. What is the layout? How is everything going to flow? Now, all of this is eventually going to be passed to our front-end engineering agent. Now, while this was running, I also ran our DevOps engineer in the background. And so what this does is in this first scope, when we're in like the earlier phase of local development, it basically went through and configured our entire project. So we have all of our lint files set up, our Babel config, our Docker files, everything basically that we would need in order to start actually running this thing, right? It even went through and created our manifest file, which is something specific that is needed for a Chrome extension. And we can see what that looks like here. So pretty robust. Now, before I ran that DevOps agent, I ran this last planning agent, which is our architecture agent. So now what this agent does is it goes through everything we've made so far. So all of the outputs from our product manager, all of the outputs from our UX UI agent, it takes all of that stuff, its understanding of the app and what it needs to do, and it builds out a detailed system architecture. So what does that mean? We're getting a comprehensive analysis basically of all of the system requirements. So for example, how can we break down the core functionality? What tech stack are we going to need to power that? What does the data architecture need to look like? How does the API need to be designed so that we can interact with this thing? What are the main security and performance considerations? What are some risks? What does the detail of the tech stack need to actually look like? What are our front-end frameworks, our back-end frameworks? How are we managing context and state? All of those sorts of things. How are the components going to work within the system? What do the database and like the data models need to actually look like? We go through all of this stuff and we can look at what that output looks like here. So just to zoom in on like a piece of this as an example, what are some of the key architectural decisions that we need for this Chrome extension thing? Well, we're going to need the Chrome extension manifest, which we looked at a moment ago. We need to make sure it's highly performant because this is actually all going to run in the user's browser. We're going to use Google's web worker for the image processing. We're going to use an event-driven architecture. And we even get some documentation specifying, hey, this is for the backend engineering agent. They're going to need to know that these are our core endpoints and what the data types need to look like. So super detailed, overarching system documentation. So why do we run through the system architecture agent? Just because you're a solo founder and maybe you're not a super highly trained CTO or head of engineering or whatever it might be, that doesn't mean we can't work toward a world where we're able to create technical solutions despite not being the most technical person in the world. Because one of the biggest bottlenecks of a solo founder or a vibe coder that's just trying to build something cool for themselves, like a tinkerer, is that you have this really ambitious project, but you don't have the technical knowledge. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of tools and patterns and systems that you may just not be aware of that would help you achieve what you're trying to achieve a lot more easily and sustainably. Because choosing the wrong database or backend framework or anything like that can be soul crushing later on when you realize that now you need to do it. So think of this agent kind of like a CTO. It makes critical foundational decisions. So we give the agent our product plan and it gives us back a full detailed technical specification so we know what the system needs to look like to make that thing happen. What's the tech stack? What's the database schema? What's the API contracts? All of that stuff. If we scale to 100,000 users overnight accidentally because it blows up on Product Hunt, what do we do in that situation? How do we handle that load? We want this thing to think about all of those considerations. So next up on our list is the Senior Frontend Engineering Agent. Now the reason we have that is once we have our UX and our UI framework in place and we have our backend actually set up and we know what the database is going to look like and we have all the business logic built, we need to build the front end that merges those two worlds together to make a functional app that a user can interact with. Because abstract UX and UI theory, that's great, but we, at the end of the day, need that translated into a snappy, performant front end. And so what we're going to do is we give the UX UI documentation, our backend documentation, everything that we have so far to date pretty much, and we build out our system of reusable components, what our state management system is going to look like for the app, building the actual interactivity that we've now just talked about in the UX portion. All of that stuff needs to now come alive. And so like I said earlier, this video is not going to be a full app build. That's coming later. So we're now just going to look at some of these agent configurations that I have built for you inside of this doc. So like I said, our front-end engineer is going to transform our technical specifications, the API, the design systems, all of that stuff into a production-ready user interface. So how do we go about doing that? Well, first we're going to tell it the inputs it should expect, which we've built now in previous stages, with the exception of this backend engineer that we'll look at after this one. And then we give it some guidelines about how to actually approach this implementation. So first we need to break everything down step by step, look at those user stories and the backend and all of our requirements and break it down into steps. We need to actually implement the design system. So if we were using Tailwind, for example, creating that token-based design system, we need to actually create our systems that are going to go fetch the data we need from the back end and store that data intelligently in the front end where it's needed. We need to actually build out that core user experience. We need to make sure it performs well, that it's fast, it's snappy, there's not weird stuff happening. And then we give it some other guidelines around how to actually organize itself. How should it code? And then when it's done, it returns us a comprehensive documentation so that we actually know what is built. We can look at it, we can understand how it functions. So that out of the way, we need to actually loop back a second because The front end is very much dependent upon what we build in the back end, right? What's the actual business logic of this thing? Because the back end is what actually powers the core experience of the app, and so it needs to be done very well. So much to the contrary, actually, of how vibe coding is typically shown to people, it's a very visual thing. And so we don't tend to think about, well, what's the business logic under the hood that's going to actually power this thing? Because again, the backend is the real workhorse of the app. It does all the heavy lifting. It builds the core logic so that, this thing actually turns on and works. And so what we're looking to build in this piece is we want to pass in that architecture plan and what the feature requirements are going to be. And out the other side, we want all of our API endpoints, the database schemas, the business logic, the authentication and the authorization of requests that are being made. We want all of that stuff before we really go and build the front end. And so here we can see that prompt. So again, we are practicing a spec-driven development, which means we're going to take the technical documentation and the stories that we have, and from that, we will build the back end. And so again, we're telling it what to expect as an input. So it's going to have all of the technical documentation we've done to date. And so from there, we're just telling it how to do its job properly. So for example, how should you handle database migration so that things aren't breaking on you and you want to smash your head against the keyboard? How are we going to develop our API? How are we going to integrate with external systems? What does the core business logic of this app need to actually look like? How can we optimize our backend for performance and scalability? So all of this stuff is what we now want to consider. And then again, we give it our recommended implementation approach. We want you to analyze the specs. We want you to plan out the database. We want you to run any migrations, build the logic, make sure it's tight from a security perspective, make sure it's performant, obviously, handle all the edge cases, and so on. And then again, like everything else, we're telling it what we want the output to look like. So all of this has been great so far. We've architected our app. We've built out the front-end components. We've built out the back-end components. But one of the things that is going to enable you to build something that actually works in production is that you need to have a proper QA and testing environment set up, which most vibe coders don't even think about, because you cannot rely on the happy path of what we wish would happen. Especially if you're vibe coding without a lot of testing in place, you might be breaking things that used to work. And if you're not super on top of every single file that you're editing, that is a likelihood. It is an inevitability. And so you need to just plan for it. But we still want to build fearlessly at high speed. And so that is what this is meant to help us do. And so the one big difference for this one compared with other ones that we've seen is that it's a lot more context dependent, meaning I only wanted to execute pieces of this system prompt that actually make sense relative to what is being asked. Now, in an ideal world, you could probably split this into like a back-end testing agent versus a front-end testing agent or an end-to-end testing agent, but I'm using this all in one, so maybe not token efficient, but it does the job. And so we're telling it, you're going to be invoked in one of three specific contexts. You're either going to be testing the back-end functions, which have their own considerations, the front-end functions, which have their own considerations, or you're going to be running end-to-end testing, meaning we're going to identify like that top 10% critical path that we can never have break, and we are going to have robust end-to-end testing that is done for those features. So how does it do this? Well, it needs to analyze our tech specifications. It needs to plan the test out. It needs to implement the test, depending, again, is it back-end, is it front-end, is it end-to-end? And then we want to make sure that our tests they're clean, they're readable, they follow conventions that we've already set in our app, and that any critical bugs are actually getting like reported back to us as a user, and that we have full test coverage of our entire app. So a brief little aside here on testing. This is one of the things when I first started using Amazon's Kiro that I really appreciated more than anything, is that it writes tests before it even builds the features. And obviously that's a very robust and safe way to go about your development, because you're ensuring at every step of the process that this thing is tested and that it is working. And then when you go to build your app and push it into production, you can run all of those tests before it pushes and make sure that you didn't just screw yourself. So if you leave this out of your process, then all of your future sadness is on you. Now, our last two agents are also super critical to the process. We have our DevOps agent and we have our security analyst. The DevOps agent, I kind of showed you the output of that, so I'll be brief. Inevitably, we need to get our app into the hands of people. And so we need to be able to handle the stresses of those people interacting with our system and us trying to develop quickly while not breaking the system that is there. So this agent is meant to automate that all as best we can. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to give it our code and everything we've built, and it's going to give us back all of the configurations that we need in order to deploy this thing. So we're talking about Docker file configurations, GitHub actions, an actual integration and deployment pipeline that can run our tests automatically before it tries to deploy and tells us if it failed and doesn't deploy it if it failed. All of that stuff is super, super important, and that's what this agent is meant to do. So similar to our QA agent, there are different scopes where we're going to be invoking this thing. And this is a personal preference. When I'm in the early stages of my process and I'm developing for myself, or it's just like a tiny little project, I like to do a lot of things locally. And so before I start building my backend and my front end, I want to make sure that I can actually like run things in Docker and is running locally on my machine. And so if that is the stage we're in, then it's going to invoke this local development mode. But if we're past stage 5 and we're ready to run this thing and send it into production, it's going to build out a production deployment system. So again, we're telling it what are the inputs that it's going to have, what are the different tech stacks that it might have and need to conform to, what do we want local development environments to actually look like for us, what are our principles for local development, which might be different, right? We might be wanting to optimize for the speed of things instead of being super production optimized, for example. And so we continue on and on just outlining these production considerations versus these local development considerations. How should secrets be managed? What are our deployment scripts going to look like? How will we, again, integrate testing into it? And all of that good stuff. So last but definitely not least is our security analyst. Now, one of the biggest, honestly, validated piles of shit that get thrown at vibe coders is that the apps tend to have security flaws. And the last thing we want to do is try to build something that's actually meant to help people and then have it shit the bed because we did something really dumb. Because a single security problem can literally ruin your business overnight. There's been a lot of really high profile vibe coded app cases of this recently. And I'll be honest, you can't possibly be a security expert on top of every other thing we're trying to do. So we need to try to leverage these tools as best as possible. So this agent is meant to be our on-demand security analyst that can look through everything we've built and check it against known best practices, research the web for known vulnerabilities, make sure those aren't in our apps, use known MCP servers that can actually scrub through our app and make sure that we're not doing stuff that's really dumb. That's what we want to do in this stage. Make sure we're not shooting ourselves in the foot and shooting people that might trust us in the foot. Now, at the risk of this video going super long and knowing that I'm literally going to do this in the next video for a full app build, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but again, you will have access to this entire prompt if you want it. And again, it's going through things like, hey, here's how we protect our API endpoints. Here's how we can make sure there's not clear issues with some of our dependencies that we have in our projects, things like that. So boom, you just saw how to set up a dope army of agents to make your dreams come true. I love Claude Code agents. I think this is one of the best things that has been made this year. And I think I've made that claim 2 times maybe. So it's August. I think I can make that third claim. We get one awesome thing per quarter. Now, again, knowing that we have these awesome reasoning agents that we can use, that's only half the battle. So in the next video, we're going to take these things and orchestrate them into a phased system where we loop through with some of them and actually build new features. So we're going to go from a raw idea through to a fully complete project, something that people can actually sign up for and pay money for. So code, databases, deployments, the whole thing. And I'm going to try to get the whole thing done in a day, if not a weekend. But here's the catch, because there's always a catch. While this may just be the best video I think that I ever made, or maybe I was just really happy this morning thinking about this video, the YouTube algorithm is brutal for creators that are like under 50,000 subs. It's actually really hard to get traction on videos. sometimes it can feel like you're shouting off into the void. So if you don't subscribe and hit the notification bell, there's good odds we might never see each other ever again. And I'll be honest with you, you really do not want to miss the next video because it's going to be dope. So Hulk smash that subscribe button and tell me in the comments if you have an idea for an app that you want to see me build, because maybe, just maybe, that will be the one that I choose to do. So that's it. Get the agents in the doc below in the video. Until next time, peace out.